What happens when a former president walks onto a morning show set and everything that could go wrong does go wrong? What happens when two strong personalities collide in front of millions of viewers and neither one is willing to back down? You're about to find out, because what went down between Donald Trump and Michael Strahan on Good Morning America was nothing short of explosive. Before we get into it, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about this whole situation, because trust me, you're going to have opinions. The green room was buzzing with energy that morning. Donald Trump sat in a leather chair, his team surrounding him like a protective barrier. Across from him, producers were running through last-minute checks. Clipboards in hand, headsets crackling with communication from the control room. Trump's PR director leaned in close, whispering something about keeping things light, staying on message, promoting the new book. Trump waved her off with a dismissive gesture. Michael Strahan was in his own corner of the studio, going over his notes one final time. He'd interviewed hundreds of people over the years, from athletes to actors to politicians. But this one felt different. There was an edge to it that he couldn't quite shake. His producer, Sandra, appeared at his shoulder with a concerned expression. Sandra told him they were getting word that Trump's team was already pushing back on some of the prepared questions. Strahan looked up from his notes, eyebrows raised. He asked what questions specifically. Sandra hesitated, then said basically anything about the legal issues. Anything about the election. Anything that could be considered confrontational. Strahan let out a long breath and told her he appreciated the heads-up, but he wasn't changing his questions. Sandra nodded. She'd expected that answer and walked away to deal with the growing tension backstage. The studio audience filed in, taking their seats, phones out, excited to be part of something they'd watched from their living rooms for years. The energy was electric. That particular buzz that comes when everyone knows they're about to witness something significant. The lights came up, the cameras positioned themselves, and the floor director began his countdown. Strahan walked onto the set with his characteristic smile, the audience applauding as he took his seat. He welcomed everyone watching at home, mentioned the lineup for the morning, and then, with practiced ease, he introduced his first guest. Donald Trump walked out to a mixed reaction from the audience. Some applause, some silence, some whispers. He shook Strahan's hand with that firm grip he was known for and settled into the chair across from the host. The opening was smooth enough. Strahan congratulated Trump on his new book, asked about the writing process, let him talk about his vision for the country. Trump was in his element, gesturing broadly, dropping names, telling anecdotes that painted him in the heroic light he preferred. The audience laughed at the right moments. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then Strahan shifted in his seat, glanced down at his notes, and the tone changed. He said he wanted to talk about something that a lot of Americans were concerned about. Trump's expression shifted slightly, a tightening around the eyes. Strahan continued, bringing up the ongoing legal challenges, the multiple indictments, the claims of election interference. He asked Trump directly how he responded to critics who said he was undermining democratic institutions. Trump's jaw clenched. He leaned forward, pointing a finger toward Strahan, and said, "That was a nasty question." He said it was exactly the kind of fake news narrative that the media loved to push. He told Strahan he expected better from him, that he thought they were going to have a real conversation, not some hit job disguised as an interview. Strahan didn't flinch. He said with all due respect, these were questions that millions of Americans wanted answers to. He wasn't trying to ambush anyone. He was trying to have a substantive conversation. Trump cut him off, his voice rising slightly. He said Strahan was reading from a script that someone had put those questions in front of him, probably the same people who had been trying to take him down for years. The studio had gone quiet. The audience wasn't sure whether to react or stay silent. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression, every gesture. Strahan maintained his composure, his voice steady. He told Trump that nobody put words in his mouth, that these were legitimate questions based on real events that had been covered extensively by every major news outlet in the country. Trump laughed, but there was no humor in it. He asked Strahan if he really believed everything he read in the papers. He said the media had been wrong about him from day one, that they'd predicted he'd never win, that they'd spent years trying to prove conspiracies that didn't exist. And now they were doing the same thing all over again. He turned slightly toward the audience, playing to them now. He asked if they believed the fake news or if they believed what they could see with their own eyes. Strahan interjected, his tone firmer now. He said this wasn't about belief, it was about facts. There were court cases. There were indictments handed down by grand juries. There were documented attempts to overturn election results. These weren't media fabrications. These were legal realities. He asked Trump again how he justified his actions to the American people who were watching right now. Trump's face flushed. He said Strahan was being disrespectful, that he'd come on the show in good faith and was being treated like a criminal. He said it was a disgrace that Good Morning America should be ashamed of themselves. He asked if this was really how they treated their guests. Strahan responded immediately, saying they treated their guests with respect, but they also asked them real questions. That was journalism. That was what the audience deserved. Trump stood up slightly in his chair, his body language aggressive now. He told Strahan he didn't need to be lectured about journalism by someone who used to play football. Strahan's expression hardened. He said that was a cheap shot, and Trump knew it. He'd earned his place at this desk through years of hard work, and he wasn't going to apologize for asking tough questions. That was his job. The tension was suffocating. Producers in the control room were frantically discussing whether to cut to commercial, but the ratings were spiking. People were glued to their screens, and the decision was made to let it play out. Trump settled back into his chair, but his posture remained defensive. Arms crossed, jaw tight. Strahan shuffled his notes, regaining his center. He said he wanted to move forward to give Trump a chance to address some of the specific allegations. He brought up the classified documents case, the charges related to mishandling sensitive national security information. He asked Trump to explain to viewers why those documents were at his residence, and why there had been such resistance to returning them. Trump exploded. He said those were his documents, that he had every right to them, that the Presidential Records Act gave him authority that the Justice Department was deliberately misinterpreting, citing legal experts who said that interpretation was incorrect. Trump interrupted, saying those experts were biased, probably paid by his opponents. Strahan raised his voice for the first time, saying Trump couldn't just dismiss everyone who disagreed with him as biased. At some point, he had to take responsibility. Trump shot back, asking what Strahan knew about taking responsibility. Had he ever been in a position where the entire weight of the country was on his shoulders? Where every decision he made was scrutinized and twisted by people who hated him? Strahan said this wasn't about him. It was about Trump and the choices he'd made. Trump said that was exactly the problem. Everything was always about him. Strahan countered that the real issues included accountability, the rule of law, and whether someone in power believed they were above it. The two men stared at each other, neither willing to break eye contact. The audience sat frozen, caught between fascination and discomfort. This wasn't the polished, rehearsed television they were used to. This was raw, unfiltered confrontation, and nobody knew quite how to react. Strahan leaned back slightly, trying to reset the conversation. But Trump wasn't interested in de-escalation. He pointed at the camera, addressing the viewers directly. He said the American people were smart. They could see what was happening here. They could see a biased host trying to make him look bad because that's what the establishment wanted. Strahan cut in, his patience visibly thinning. He said Trump needed to stop playing the victim. He'd been given a platform, a national audience, and instead of addressing legitimate concerns, he was deflecting and attacking. Trump's eyes narrowed. He asked Strahan if he'd ever been investigated for things he didn't do. If he'd ever had his entire life turned upside down by people determined to destroy him, regardless of the truth. Strahan said no. But that didn't mean the investigations against Trump were invalid. It meant Trump had made choices that led to those investigations. Trump shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. He said Strahan didn't understand because he'd never been in that position. He'd never had the kind of enemies Trump had. Never had people willing to weaponize the justice system against him. He asked for specifics, for concrete examples beyond vague accusations. Trump's frustration was palpable. He said he'd given specifics 1,000 times, but people didn't want to hear them. They wanted sound bites. They wanted controversy. They wanted him to play along with their predetermined story. Strahan said that wasn't true. He genuinely wanted to understand Trump's perspective. But Trump had to actually provide one beyond just attacking everyone who questioned him. The former president stood up, not fully, not walking away, but enough to signal he was done with the line of questioning. He said this interview was exactly what he'd expected, exactly what his team had warned him about. He should have listened. Strahan remained seated, his voice calm but firm. He told Trump he was welcome to leave if he wanted to, but running away from tough questions didn't make them go away. It just made him look like he couldn't answer them. Trump sat back down, but the hostility in his posture was unmistakable. He said he wasn't running from anything. He'd faced harder questions from much tougher people than Michael Strahan. Strahan's eyebrows raised. He said, if that was true, then answering his questions should be easy. Trump said the questions weren't hard. They were dishonest. They were phrased in ways that assumed guilt, that ignored context, that were designed to make him look bad no matter how he responded. Strahan shuffled through his notes deliberately, letting the silence hang for a moment. Then he looked up and asked about January 6th. The words hit the studio like a thunderclap. Trump's entire demeanor changed. His face flushed deeper. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He said he knew that was coming. Of course, that was coming. It was the go-to attack, the thing his opponents used whenever they wanted to shut down any conversation about his accomplishments. Strahan said it wasn't an attack. It was history. It happened. The Capitol was breached. People died. And there were serious questions about Trump's role in the events of that day. Trump interrupted immediately, his voice sharp. He said he'd told people to be peaceful. He'd explicitly said to protest peacefully and patriotically. Anyone who claimed otherwise was lying or hadn't bothered to watch the actual speech. Strahan countered that the speech was only part of the story. What about the hours afterward when the violence was unfolding and Trump didn't call it off? What about the pressure campaign on the vice president? What about the systematic attempts to overturn the election results in multiple states? Trump's response was immediate and aggressive. He said the election was stolen, that there was overwhelming evidence of fraud, that millions of Americans knew the truth, even if the media refused to report it. Strahan's expression hardened. He said that claim had been investigated, litigated, and rejected by courts across the country, including judges Trump himself had appointed. At what point did Trump accept that he'd lost? Trump said he'd never accept a fraudulent result, that doing so would be betraying everyone who voted for him. The back and forth was relentless. Now, neither man giving an inch. Strahan brought up specific court cases, specific recounts, specific audits that had all confirmed the election results. Trump dismissed each one, claiming they were compromised, that the evidence had never been properly examined. that the system was rigged against anyone who challenged it. Strahan asked if Trump understood how dangerous that rhetoric was, how it undermined faith in democracy itself. Trump said what undermined faith in democracy was allowing fraudulent elections to stand unchallenged. Strahan took a breath, visibly trying to maintain his composure. He said they were going in circles. That Trump seemed determined to reject any information that contradicted his preferred narrative. Trump said that was rich. Coming from someone who worked for a network that had pushed the Russia hoax for years. Strahan said that investigation had led to multiple convictions that it wasn't a hoax. Trump waved him off dismissively, saying those convictions had nothing to do with him, that the whole thing was a witch hunt from start to finish. The conversation had devolved into something barely resembling an interview anymore. It was a verbal battle. Two men with completely incompatible views of reality, neither willing to concede anything to the other. The studio crew watched in stunned silence, cameras capturing every moment. Knowing this was going to be replayed and analyzed for days, maybe weeks. Strahan glanced at his producer off-camera, who gave him a signal to wrap up the segment. But there was no clean way to do it. Strahan said he wanted to ask one more question before they ran out of time. Trump said he was sure it would be just as fair and balanced as all the others. The sarcasm was thick. Strahan ignored it and asked about Trump's plans for the future. Whether he intended to run again, whether he believed he could unite a deeply divided country. Trump's response was immediate. He said the country was divided because of people like Strahan, because of a media that lied constantly, because of a political establishment that put its own interests above the American people. Strahan said that wasn't an answer to his question. Trump said it was the only answer that mattered. Everything else was just noise. Strahan pressed him again, asking directly if he was running. Trump smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said he'd make an announcement when he was ready, that the American people would be the first to know. Not some morning show host who'd spent the last 20 minutes trying to attack him. Strahan said he hadn't attacked anyone. He'd asked questions. Trump said there was no difference anymore, that asking questions was just another form of attack. When the questions were designed to make him look guilty, the tension was suffocating. Strahan looked directly into the camera, then back at Trump. He said he thought Americans deserved a leader who could answer tough questions without claiming persecution, who could take responsibility instead of blaming everyone else. Trump said Americans deserved a leader who would fight for them, who wouldn't back down when the elites tried to silence him, who understood that sometimes the truth wasn't popular, but it was still the truth. Strahan's jaw tightened. He said the truth was supposed to be based on facts, not feelings, not political convenience. Trump leaned back in his chair, his arms still crossed defensively. He said facts were whatever the media decided they were. And right now, the media had decided he was guilty of everything they could possibly accuse him of. Strahan said that wasn't how facts worked, and Trump knew it. Facts existed independently of opinion, independently of spin. Trump laughed darkly and said that was naive. That Strahan had been in this business long, enough to know that facts were always subject to interpretation. The host shifted forward, his elbows on his knees, trying one more time to break through. He asked Trump if he ever considered that maybe, just maybe, some of the criticism he faced was legitimate. That maybe some of the legal troubles he was dealing with were consequences of actual actions he'd taken, not some grand conspiracy. Trump's face hardened into stone. He said that question revealed everything wrong with this interview. Everything wrong with the way people like Strahan approached him. There was always an assumption of guilt. Always a presumption that he must have done something wrong. Strahan said that wasn't true. He was simply asking Trump to consider alternative perspectives. Trump said he'd considered them and rejected them because they were wrong. Simple as that. Strahan asked how Trump could be so certain, so absolutely convinced that everyone else was mistaken, and only he saw things clearly. Trump said because he'd lived it, because he'd been there, because he knew what actually happened versus what the media reported happened. Those were two very different things. The audience was completely silent now. Watching this clash of worldviews play out in real time, some people had their phones out recording, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about long after the show ended. Strahan looked exhausted, the weight of trying to have a rational conversation with someone who rejected the basic premise of shared reality clearly. Taking its toll, he told Trump that he appreciated him coming, and even though it had been contentious. Trump said contentious was an understatement, that this had been one of the most biased interviews he'd ever sat through. Strahan's composure cracked slightly. He said Trump had been given every opportunity to make his case, to explain his positions, to address the concerns that millions of Americans had. Instead, he'd spent the entire interview attacking, deflecting, and playing the victim. Trump stood up this time fully, decisively. He said he was done, that this was a waste of his time, that he'd tried to have a real conversation, but Strahan was more interested in scoring points than actually listening. Strahan stood as well, his height matching Trump's, his former athlete's frame imposing. He said Trump was the one who wasn't listening, who came in with his mind already made up about how unfairly he'd be treated, and then fulfilled his own prophecy by being combative from the start. Trump said he was combative because he had to be, because the second he showed any weakness, people like Strahan would pounce on it and use it against him. That was the game, and he'd learned how to play it better than anyone. The two men stood facing each other, the space between them charged with animosity.